everyone. Welcome to the first session of our virtual parent series. Today, we will be discussing strategies for helping students cope with stress. We're so glad that you're able to join us. So this series is being funded by the Monroe-Meyer Guild. We thank the Guild very much for making this series possible. And this series is also being offered in collaboration with the School-Based Mental Health Collaborative, or SBMHC. The SBMHC is a network of 13 agencies from the Omaha metro area who work together to improve school mental health services. I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. So my name is Dr. Mindy Chadwell. I'm a licensed psychologist and board-certified behavior analyst with the Monroe-Meyer Institute at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I direct our comprehensive clinical services for our school mental health programs, and my primary role is in providing mental health services to children and families in school settings, as well as providing training to our master's, predoctoral, and postdoctoral trainees. I have 3 children, ages 15, 9, and 3 months, actually 4 months today, so I'm really stretching across developmental levels right now. I'm joined by Dr. Caitlin Young, who is also an assistant professor and licensed psychologist at MMI. Dr. Young specializes in school-based mental health and works with rural and urban schools to implement school mental health systems. And last but not least is Joe Graham. Joe is a predoctoral intern on the comprehensive school-based mental health track at MMI. Joe is interested in enhancing the implementation of mental health services in school settings for students and staff alike. And here is our agenda for today. We will provide brief information on the current state of youth mental health concerns, and an overview of why it's important to equip our youth with strategies for coping with stress. We'll then talk through the adaptive function of stress, followed by some of the common signs of stress in children, and then discuss strategies to reduce stress using our THRIVE acronym. In this webinar, we're really working to provide strategies for parents of children from all developmental levels, including youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So thank you in advance for providing an inclusive and supportive environment, even if all of the discussion points do not apply to your child's specific developmental level. We will then end our series today with time for Q&A with our panelists. Okay, so we want to start off by hearing from you. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. If you had to rate your child's current stress level, where would you rate it? We have as cool as a cucumber, so they're coping really well. They're doing all right, so maybe a little bit of difficulty. They are struggling to manage stress, and the last one is they are extremely stressed. So take just a moment to just rate overall, how do you feel like your child is doing with managing stress? It looks like everyone has answered now, so I'm going to end the poll and then share the results. So it looks like we're noticing that overall, we feel like our children are doing all right, coping with stress, maybe a little bit of difficulty, and also noticing that we're struggling to manage stress. Thanks so much for responding to that. Let's go ahead and transition to talking about why focusing on stress management is important. Why should we as parents, as mental health professionals, as educators, etc., all of the different hats that everyone wears, why should we care about teaching our youth to manage stress? And I think you're all here because you already find it to be important, and we do as well. But I want us to take a look at really how we're doing in terms of addressing and meeting the needs of youth when it comes to mental health. We know that childhood is really an ideal time to create a foundation for fostering positive social, emotional, and behavioral skills. It's also a critical time to identify and treat mental health and behavioral concerns as they emerge. So this is particularly true in the wake of COVID-19, which has resulted in what is now being referred to as a mental health crisis for our youth. Data are really just starting to come out on prevalence rates of mental health concerns since the onset of the pandemic. And what we're seeing is highly concerning. So while about 70% of public schools reported an increase in the degree to which students sought mental health services, and I think that that's really good. You know, we're noticing that with that increase, people are accessing or trying to access services. However, only 12% strongly agreed that they're able to effectively provide mental health services to students that are in need. And then more than half of the schools also reported inadequate access to licensed mental health professionals. So the purpose of our series today is to equip parents and caregivers with strategies to recognize signs of stress in their youth, teach strategies for coping and living a balanced lifestyle, and provide resources for additional support when concerns go beyond typical stress. So let's take a look at some of the sources of stress that our youth experience. So children have various demands that come from both home and school, as well as extracurricular activities if they're involved in any. At home, students may have chores that they have to complete or other household expectations that need to be met. At school, they experience academic demands that sometimes also spill over to the home environment if they're having homework. They also might experience challenges with friendships or bullying at school, or the educational inequities that exist. We also know that social media is a significant added stressor that youth are faced with navigating. And interestingly, with when social media launched, we noticed that we saw a significant increase in symptoms of anxiety and depression. So we know that that is a significant stressor that youth are facing. And then, of course, from time to time, something that we all feel is just not having enough time to meet all of the demands or navigate all of our stressors. So now, if that wasn't enough, related to COVID, youth are also experiencing or did experience stress related to distance learning, also added family stress, as well as grades or, not doing as well as they would like to academically. And also during COVID, we were faced with personal health concerns. So there was much unknown with COVID about how it would impact personal health. And that unknown factor can be a high source of stress for many. Sometimes it can feel like our stressors are really outweighing our overall well-being, and we might feel just a little bit like this. It's really important to note that our children might feel like this from all of their stressors, and also as parents, we need to recognize our own stress levels and check in with ourselves from time to time on how we're coping. Is this how we're feeling too? If so, it's likely that our children are feeling that stress as well. I was joking with my mom the other day. As many of you know, having newborns, having infants can be highly stressful. And I was noticing that as my stress level was starting to increase, I was noticing that she was starting to increase with stress, just exhibited through increased fussiness. So I told my mom, I need to channel my inner calm. I had to really work to think about how I was doing and use my own coping strategies to try to calm my stress response. So it's just important as parents that we check in with ourselves and that we're practicing our own stress management techniques. Something we want to note is the idea that stress is really in our biology. Our stress response is ingrained in us. We have physical indications of a fight or flight response, and really a fight, flight, or freeze response. This allows our bodies to take action when exposed to certain environmental stressors. So this graphic here just describes how our bodies can respond when we're faced with those environmental stressors. So common stress responses include having dilated pupils, trembling throughout our bodies. We might often feel this in like our legs or in our hands. Our hearts start to beat faster and our breathing might become more shallow. These symptoms are getting our bodies ready for action, ready to take on that stressor. Giving this knowledge to our youth when they're developmentally ready to understand it can be really helpful in helping them navigate or helping them start to manage their stress. What we know about our youth is that they are highly resilient, meaning that overall, when they are faced with stressors, they're able to adapt and cope very well. And one of the highest determinants of how youth cope with stressors and cope when faced with difficult situations is having at least one supportive adult in their lives. So this can be a parent or caregiver, this can be an educator or a coach, but having that one supportive adult makes such a difference in how they cope with stressors. What we want to point out here is that we know that stress and anxiety impacts our performance. In fact, it can actually help our performance in some situations. So when we have low to moderate levels of stress and anxiety, our performance actually improves. Now, when we get to high amounts of stress and anxiety that you can see over here, our performance does start to decrease. So what we want to do is equip our youth with strategies for noticing when we're starting to feel stress coming on, and really anticipating, hey, that situation might make me feel a little bit more nervous or a little bit more stressed out. And then also cope with the stress when it does emerge. But it's important for them to know that some stress can actually be a good thing. If they had no stress or worries, related to an upcoming test, for example, they may not prepare adequately or may not do enough prep work to perform in that situation. Same thing with an upcoming sports game. They may not perform to their highest ability. So some stress can be good. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Young now to talk through how we notice stress or signs of stress at each developmental level.
Hello, everyone. So yes, at each developmental level, there are several signs that we can watch out for when stress is no longer benefiting youth, right? We're outside of the optimal level of stress. It's becoming too much. And then we may actually be, some of that stress may actually be making it more difficult to complete everyday tasks, and just more challenging to live a life that we want. All right, so what are some of the signs of stress at each developmental level? So within infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, we want to notice if there are any changes to their sleep, eating, and emotional regulation. With this, I want to mention that young kids have difficulties with these areas, for so many different reasons, and it doesn't necessarily have to be stress in particular. However, if we notice shifts in some of these habits, it could be due to stress that they are experiencing. We might also see increases of nightmares, increased reassurance seeking, as well as avoidance of certain things. So these are all different things that we want to kind of be on a lookout for if we are trying to see if maybe some of our younger youth are having some difficulties with responding to some environmental stressors. For school-age youth, we want to keep out an eye for all the signs discussed for younger youth. Additionally, we might also see increased irritability and outbursts, or that the child is maybe very emotional or tearful. A child who's experiencing stress may withdraw from situations that they would otherwise be interested in participating in. Some kids may just naturally be okay with participating less in social events or less time around family or friends. However, if you notice that your child has made a significant shift in wanting to spend time with people or are now not wanting to, that could be a sign that they're having difficulties with coping with some of the different stress in their lives. Noticeable changes in school performance is another. So watching out for grades and difficulties with getting to or staying in school can be another sign. And lastly, physical complaints will probably come up. Things such as your child reporting more headaches, stomach aches, or muscle pains can be indicative that your child is having a difficult time navigating through a stressful event or stressful time. And then for adolescents, all of the previous warning signs remain, including changes in sleep, eating, and emotional regulation. You might also see that a teen is engaging in less self-care habits or may even engage in more risky behavior, such as substance use. Again, just because a child or an adolescent is showing these types of behaviors, it does not necessarily mean that a large stressor or a bunch of stressors are impacting them. It really is important just to understand how your child was doing before in school, at home, with friends, or out in the community, and noticing if there was a change in their behavior and which might be them making it more difficult for them to do the things that they typically have been able to do. So now what we want to do is practice recognizing some of these signs through a hypothetical situation. So a typically outgoing and academically strong Talia has been spending a lot of time laying on the couch and in her bed. When asked how Talia wants to RSVP for her best friend's birthday party, she says, "I don't know. I don't feel like it." You recently noticed that Talia seemed distracted during a family outing to her favorite restaurant, and Talia's grades have been also slowly been slipping. What are some of the signs that Talia might be having a strong reaction to stress? You might notice that she's maybe spending less time with friends. She maybe doesn't want to go to her best friend's birthday party. Maybe that's a little different. She might seem distractible. You might have noticed that when you all went out to her favorite restaurant, changes in school performance, and maybe just more tired than usual. She's spending a lot more time laying on the couch or her bed. So those are some of the signs here that maybe Talia is having a more difficult time kind of navigating through different stressors that she's been experiencing. So now that we have an understanding of the signs of stress, we want to review some strategies then for reducing the stress, right? What are some of the things that we can do to kind of navigate through some of those difficult times? There are several ways that we can support youth as they navigate through a stressful time. As we are considering how to help a child in coping with stress, we want to consider their developmental level and what skills they may already have to best understand how we can support them. From there, we can adjust our communication and our expectations to help them navigate through a stressful time. Having consistent yet flexible schedules and routines helps develop a structure and can give a child a sense of predictability, which is really helpful when a child may feel like they're unable to predict what might happen during a particularly stressful time. So it is really important that we have just that balance of that structure. We want consistent yet flexible. Additionally, we want to schedule quality time with loved ones and encourage healthy social interactions to best set up the child for success. As Dr. Chadwell was sharing earlier, an important component of ensuring that a child is able to effectively navigate through a stressful time is having a supportive adult in their lives. So it's important that we continue to support them through this by spending some quality time with them. And then throughout a stressful time, knowing what coping strategies work for them will be important, because then as a caregiver, you can help them in implementing the strategies that they have been successful in using. And then before we get into several different coping techniques, something that we wanted to highlight is that a lot of stress can come from feeling like there's a lot outside of our control. For a child or an adolescent, a lot is determined for them, right? Including what school they go to, what teachers they have, what they have to eat for each meal, maybe the amount of homework that's assigned, or maybe even their after-school activity schedule. That being said, if kids are feeling like a lot is outside of their control, it can be helpful to work with them to understand what is inside of their control. For many, we can help them determine what media they consume, what activities they engage in, the friends that they keep around, and study skills that they can use to ease their mind and their bodies and cultivate a more helpful, immediate environment. And importantly, with intention and practice, a child can learn how to manage and/or control their responses to different stressors. I want to make it clear that it's not likely that we can reduce all of our stress responses where like nothing ever phases us. However, we can have a plan in place that allows us to cope effectively and to live the life that we want despite the stress that we may experience in our everyday lives. Knowing that we have strategies and a plan in place to cope with stress leads us to specific strategies that can be helpful for youth. For the next few strategies, we're going to go through the THRIVE acronym. The THRIVE acronym, we've been using this a lot in our practice, and it has been helpful for youth in understanding that stressors in life are unavoidable, but we can think about and respond to stress differently so we can live a life that we value. All right, so for this first letter, the T within THRIVE, it stands for taking notice of our thoughts and of our feelings. We all have thoughts, and our thoughts can be helpful or unhelpful in different situations. Thoughts that might be helpful, maybe things like, remember to do your homework, or you studied really hard for that test. These types of thoughts we likely want to hold on to because that can help encourage us. And then some thoughts are unhelpful. Thoughts like, I hate science class, or why is my sibling so annoying? Probably get in the way of focusing in science class or trying to change the way that we interact with somebody else. Sometimes these unhelpful thoughts can become really loud in our minds. It's maybe like the only thing that we can think about, or they might get stuck. It might be playing on repeat in our mind. And then we have a hard time really thinking about anything else. These types of thoughts, rather than trying to reject them or think, just stop thinking like this, we can just notice these thoughts. We can watch our thoughts and our feelings come and go, just like leaves flowing down a stream. In the slides, you'll notice a link to a video that we share a lot with kids and families. It's a brief 7-minute video that can be used to help practice this strategy. We are not going to have time to watch it today, but this is a resource for you all to watch later. You can honestly simply just go into YouTube and type in leaves on a stream metaphor, and you'll find a bunch of different videos that kind of take kids and adults through this practice of letting some thoughts go and practicing just noticing our thoughts rather than getting caught up in them. H within the Thrive acronym stands for being in the here and now. Sometimes during a stressful time, we might think a lot about what is stressing us out. When we are noticing that we're having a difficult time getting out of our heads and stepping into our present lives, we can practice taking notice of what is happening right here and right now. We can do this through a variety of activities, including noticing our 5 senses, finding all of the colors in the rainbow, practicing muscle relaxation, or really focusing on our breath. With all of these strategies, it's helpful to practice them when we are not feeling stressed, so that when we are stressed, we don't become stressed about trying to test out a new strategy. And rather, by having these things practiced and down where we feel confident in using them, we can just naturally go to them because we know it works when we are in a stressful situation. The next letter is within Thrive is R. R within the Thrive acronym stands for reaching out for support. As Dr. Chadwell mentioned earlier, having social support contributes to our overall well-being. When supporting your child, it can be helpful in encouraging them to consider who their support people are, including their friends, teachers, parents, grandparents, or other people in their lives, maybe a coach. And it's important for me to know that it is important that somebody else perceives social support. So when we're going through a stressful time, it's not necessarily the case that we need to encourage youth to spend more time with their social support or their support people. Rather, it's just simply beneficial to feel that social support and recognize that these are individuals in our lives that we can rely on. The letter I within the Thrive acronym stands for identifying actions within our control. As we discussed earlier, there are several things that are outside of their control for youth. However, there are several things that are within their control. We just might have to help them identify those things, because although we cannot change those things outside of our control, we can do things that are important to us. For example, you might work with your child to identify things that they can do to be active, help others, or help them do things that they enjoy. V within the Thrive acronym stands for values, or things in life that we find important or meaningful. When things are going well and we don't have a lot of stress maybe happening in our lives, we might notice that we just do things naturally that we find important, or we might act in accordance to our values. During times of stress, however, it can be more difficult to do these things. Therefore, during times of stress, it can be helpful to spend a few moments each day to remind ourselves of the type of person that we want to be and commit to action for these things. As a caregiver, you can work with your child to help them understand what types of things they find important and how they might live out those values. In a few slides, I will introduce a resource that has an activity that will help structure a conversation like this. And lastly, the letter E in Thrive stands for encourage and evaluate. At the end of the day, we expect youth will experience success in implementing new coping strategies or coping through stress. Likewise, we can expect that youth might not respond to stress in a way that's ultimately beneficial or helpful for them. It's really okay that this happens. It happens to everybody, even adults. It's important to reflect and celebrate when things have gone well and readjust when we want to do things differently next time. So on this next slide, there is a free resource that we'll be sending to you that has activities for each of the letters within the Thrive acronym. And in general, many of these activities are likely best suited for children ages about 10 years old or above. However, there are different ways that we can adapt some of the things that we've already talked about today to help support youth across developmental levels. So I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Chadwell to talk through how you might take some of these strategies and adopt them for your child.
Thank you, Dr. Young. So here are a few considerations when teaching our learners with intellectual and developmental disabilities strategies to cope with stress, as well as thinking about how we might adapt some of the strategies that were discussed thus far. We encourage you to ask yourself, when do I notice my child appearing most calm and relaxed? What activities are they engaging in? Are they listening to music? Do they have a favorite toy or a favorite character? Maybe a favorite sensation? Also, what are the settings like? Is stimulation low or high? What are the sounds in the environment? The smells? Is it at home or at school? And then finally, who is involved? Make a list of these things to start determining ways you might be able to incorporate some of these stimuli into other environments and situations for coping with stress. In addition, as parents, you of course know your child the best, but it can be really beneficial to reach out to others to get their perspective. Children spend a lot of time in school. So reach out to the school to see if there are any additional activities that could be added to your list. What do they notice in that environment? And then you can also share your list of activities with the school too, to really create that comprehensive care. We want to describe various teaching strategies for consideration. So the first is to directly teach the coping strategies using what we call behavioral skills training. This is just a fancy name for a 4-step process. The first step is to provide direct instruction or describe the skill. The next is modeling, so it's showing them how to do it. So first we tell them, second we show them. The third is rehearsing or providing them with opportunities to practice. And the final step is providing feedback on how they did. We also encourage families to practice with their child during times of low stress, like Dr. Young had mentioned. So just like learning any other new skill, practice is key to coping. Strategies are more likely to be used in times of high stress if they've become fluent in them during times of low stress. And what I really like to do, I think a great time to practice is before going to bed. So this not only gets the practice completed, so checks that box, but also preps your child's body for a good night's rest. We know with our coping strategies, the purpose of them is to really calm the mind and the body. So that sets your child up for drifting off to sleep a little bit more easily, hopefully. The third strategy on here is using a visual cue or a visual schedule. We know that child behavior becomes more predictable when they know what to expect. So knowing the schedule can decrease their experience of overall stress. Along with a visual schedule is a visual cue that can prompt them to use coping strategies. So this can also be helpful. So what's nice about something like this is that children can take that visual cue with them for use in multiple environments. So an example of a visual cue would be like a coping card that provides options for strategies for coping with stress. And that could be then used at home. It could also be taken with them to school. And we'll show an example of that on an upcoming slide. We also encourage families to incorporate preferred activities and items whenever possible. So preferred activities and items can be used to increase compliance with practice opportunities. Sometimes, children don't want to practice. So we can think about how can we use, their preferred activities to get them to practice. So we might say, let's practice our deep breathing first, and then we can play with this toy. Or if your child has a preferred movie or TV character, is there an opportunity that you can use that character as a model? So for example, YouTube has, a lot of video clips, and if they have a preferred character, you might check to see, can you find something where that character is modeling a coping strategy? And then finally, keep stimulation low. We know that there are some learners that have a sensitivity to sensory stimulation. So the more stimulation they experience, the higher level of stress they might experience. So one way we can help them cope with stress is by taking them to an environment that has less stimulation. So for example, like less, loud noises, or, maybe dimmer lights. Just thinking about what are the sensory, components of the environment that you're in, and how best does your child cope. So here's an example of the 4-step behavioral skills training process. So Lily noticed her daughter having increased tension in her body when stressed. She decided to teach her progressive muscle relaxation as a coping strategy to help her decrease the tension. And progressive muscle relaxation is simply intentionally tightening and loosening various muscle groups, and then noticing the feeling of tension reduction. Here are the steps of how we might use behavioral skills training to teach the skill. So the first step is to describe the skill. So we are going to practice tightening and loosening our muscles. Let's start by tightening the muscles in our hands. Squeeze your hands like you're squeezing the juice out of lemons. And then second, we model the skill. As Lily is describing the skill, she is modeling it with her own hands. And if I had my video on, you would see me tightening my hands into fists and, practicing squeezing the juice out of the lemon. And then third, we provide opportunities to practice. So Lily prompts her daughter to practice with her. And like I mentioned, a great time to practice is right before going to bed. And then finally, step 4, we provide feedback. So Lily provides feedback to her daughter. For example, I noticed you're squeezing the muscles in your hands and letting that tension go. Excellent practice. Great job. And then here are examples of a visual schedule and a coping prompt or cue. So the links on this slide are clickable when you receive the slides. And we included a visual schedule guide, which is listed here, this visual schedule guide down here. This is a resource that just provides steps to walk through when you're developing a visual schedule. And a visual schedule walks through steps of for completion of a certain activity. So the example on this slide is for a night routine, but you can create a visual schedule for really anything. And then the second picture on here is a visual cue for deep breathing. So with that, we'd like to provide you with additional resources for supporting your child in coping with stress. So here is a list of resources for our younger youth. This would be for a developmental level of about preschool to grade 2. We have a list of books that can be helpful in teaching emotion identification and coping with emotions. So a first step in coping with stress for our younger learners is understanding emotions. And these books can be a great way to help teach those. And then we also have a list of apps. The first is Breathe, Think, Do with Sesame Street. So this app is really helpful in providing strategies for coping with big emotions. There's also Breathe Kids. So this would be for the higher end of this developmental group. It's a great app that provides different missions in which children are able to practice coping strategies. And then last on this slide is Super Stretch. So this takes a superhero approach to yoga. And then here are resources for our school age developmental level. There are 2 workbooks on here that can help youth understand and respond to stress. And then another list of apps that can be helpful for teaching coping strategies. I will say that it's really important to explore these apps with your child and prompt them to practice and practice with them. So start off by, exploring the app together and practicing together. And then over time, as your child becomes more familiar with it, they would be able to do so more independently and eventually get to a space where they don't even need the app to walk through the coping strategy. They can just kind of think about it and use it. Okay, and lastly is our list of resources for adolescents. So this would be for about middle school and above. We have the book Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life for Teens. So this is an interactive workbook that's grounded in acceptance and commitment therapy. And then we also have a list of apps. So Stop, Breathe, Think. This provides various mindfulness and meditation exercises. MindShift is an app that was developed actually for anxiety specifically. It gives information on various types of anxiety and then provides what they call cool down tools, which are strategies for coping. And then ACT Companion. So this is not for like the ACT exam. It's an app that was developed based on acceptance and commitment therapy and helps to prompt teens to engage in values-based activities and live a values-based life. Now, the strategies we outlined in this presentation are geared to really help children when they are experiencing mild stress or having difficulty coping with mild stress, and also to hopefully prevent stress from evolving into, more serious difficulties. If we are starting to notice that stress is having an impact on functioning, we wanted to provide a list of resources where you can go for more individualized support. So on this slide, we have various community mental health providers, some of whom also provide school-based mental health services. You can contact these agencies directly from this list. You can also reach out to your primary care physician to see if there's a behavioral health provider in their office. And you can also reach out to the school for additional support. We also have on this slide the Nebraska Family Helpline as a resource, the Boys Town Crisis Hotline, and then the National Suicide and Crisis Hotline. And now we'll move into our Q&A segment for today. We'll start by addressing a few questions from the registration form. Thank you for filling those in as you registered. And then we'll also answer questions that were submitted during today's webinar to that Q&A pod. So if you have something that is coming up, feel free to submit that to the Q&A pod. Okay, so our first question on here is, how can educators support these strategies? And I think our panel, I think we can try to turn on video and we'll see how we're coming through. And I'm going to turn it over to maybe Dr. Young. Do you want to start? And then Joe and I can add in anything additional.
Sure thing. So I love this question. I'm in the schools a lot, and I love thinking about how schools can kind of best support youth. So thank you so much for sending in this question. There are several ways that educators can support the different strategies that we've discussed today. And something that's really helpful is communication between home and school. So you can share with educators some of the strategies that works for your child, maybe some of the signs of stress that your child demonstrates, and some of the different things that might trigger your child's stress response. Additionally, it can be helpful to work directly with your school to understand how and in which ways they can support your child when they have maybe a more stressful event or stressful time in their lives. So then when you're kind of building up some of that home and school communication, working with teachers to understand how they might be able to best communicate to you about some of the different things that maybe stressed your student out that day and how your child was able to kind of cope with it within the classroom. And then if your child did particularly well, then maybe you can provide that encouragement of, hey, awesome, you engaged in that strategy, that I'm super proud of you. Or if maybe things didn't go as well or to plan, then maybe helping kind of practice some of those strategies that we know works and helping kind of reinforce some of those expectations for how we might handle stress in the future. I think that's kind of where I'm thinking right now. I would love to hear if Joe or Dr. Chabel, if you have any other ideas.
No, I don't. I think I would agree. I think the other thing is that I think that the schools are doing a lot
Mhm.
to really focus on child well-being and supporting youth mental health. And I think one of the things that comes to my mind is my son came home from school the other week and he was singing this empathy song. And their social emotional learning for that day was teaching the skill empathy. And they showed this YouTube video and it was a very catchy song. And he was so excited about it. So I think one of the things we can think about is, really kind of checking in with the school with that communication piece that Dr. Young, you were
Mhm.
talking about, checking in, hey, how are you teaching these things? So then we can try to, support one another in using the same or similar language to
Yeah.
really get those skills to sink in.
I love that idea. I think that's so awesome. And I think you're so right that schools are doing so much to support youth and like really supporting the whole child in this way. It's really an exciting time in the schools.
Mm, okay. And then how about what is a normal amount of stress? I have to move my window here for middle school students to have, and when do you know it's too much? So I will start and then open it up to Joe and Dr. Caitlin. This is a really great question. I'm going to broaden it for not just middle school students, but also just for what is a normal amount of stress. And I think we, talked a little bit about this in the presentation. But I think for me, the key thing to look for is when is, if there's an impact on functioning. So are we noticing if stress is impacting academic performance and just academics overall in school? Is it impacting social relationships? So how they're interacting with friends or family members. So if we see that impact on functioning, then that's when I would say that we're noticing it's too much. We need to think about what can we do to maybe better manage our stress or find a little bit more balance there, as well as possibly reach out for additional support in managing that stress. Dr. Young and Joe, do you have anything additional?
I do not know. I think you're absolutely right. Just really just kind of understanding like some of those signs of when it becomes too much. Because everybody has really a different capacity in coping with stress. And if there's a lot of things going on and maybe their personal lives, or if school's overwhelming or if work's too overwhelming, it's going to be just more difficult for us to do that. So it's really just understanding our own responses, and then for our kids, understanding kind of their responses as well. I see, Joe, that you've unmuted yourself.
Hi, yes, and I was just going to reiterate exactly what you said, is recognizing what is kind of typical of your child and then seeing some of those responses that may be different, might be a first indicator that stress might be one of those like functions of the behavior.
Yeah. And I think, something you can think about is, as parents, how can we communicate, and open up the channel for communication for conversations like this. Some youth are, able to communicate, how they're doing in terms of stress management, and that is wonderful. Other students have more of a difficult time, and that's okay too. It's just maybe then figuring out, okay, how can we communicate that? For our younger developmental levels, is there a way that we can show with our feelings, using faces, checking in, how are we doing today? And they can kind of point to, their level of stress, just, with that visual prompt. Some of our older learners also might need a visual prompt. We've had patients that have developed like color systems. Actually, I think it coincided with what their communication system was or identification system was in the school environment. But we're able to use that in therapy for communicating, are they at a red today or a blue today? And that was a way that we were able to get them to communicate to parents on how they were doing with managing stress for that particular day. Okay. How about the next one is, how do you help your child maintain motivation to implement coping strategies? And I'm going to, Joe, if you want to start with this one, and then we can kind of add in too.
Sure, absolutely. And I just want to recognize first that it is really hard to both like become motivated and then stay motivated when we're stressed. And so one way that we can help with motivation is we can provide a really simple but effective scheduling technique. And we might have already been doing this technique before, maybe without like awareness or consciousness. And this is called the PREMAC principle. And the PREMAC principle uses a first then rule. And what that does is it pairs a desirable task with an unpreferred task. And when we do that pairing and we immediately pair that desired task with the unpreferred activity, that increases the likelihood that the unpreferred task gets done. And so, for example, that might be first we do homework and then we can play video games, or first we eat our vegetables and then we can have dessert. And so as we provide that scheduling for them, that increases motivation when the child knows that there's going to be something that they're going to look forward to after the activity that they're not really looking forward to. It's our jobs as caregivers that we need to be clear and consistent with these. And what I mean is, like, we want to be explicit with the first then order. And by being clear, we're building up that sequence and that consistency for that child and starting to build those expectations. We also build that sequence, which helps to learn a routine that's in place for both fun activities and activities that we might have to work through or may not be as enjoyable. The second thing that might help with motivation is called behavioral activation. And when we understand that our behaviors and our emotions are linked to how we respond to the environment, we can start to be more explicit or purposeful with the different behaviors that we are doing. And so, for example, if we have a stressor in our life, such as a big test or a really big game at the end of the week, or maybe even like a transition between classes or talking to a peer or a coach or a teacher, that can lead to a really intense behavior like anger or worry, sadness, or hopelessness. And we might respond negatively to our environment. And so with behavioral activation, we want to practice a certain behavior very purposefully and activate that positive emotional state. And so we're engaging in these types of behaviors that increases mood, and it makes it more likely that we continue that behavior. So, for example, if we engage in a healthy eating, like eating nutritious foods, that can make us feel both mentally and physically better, which leads us to practicing more healthy eating techniques. And so how do we practice or behavioral activation? How do we practice behavioral activation? And the first thing we want to do is we want to notice our child's behaviors and how they affect their emotions. And so let's think back to the activities, the settings, or the people where our child appears calm or frustrated, worried, or angry. And then we want to develop an adaptive behavior and identify that behavior that the child wants to increase. And again, we want to be specific with those behaviors and make it an achievable goal if possible and necessary. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to monitor the progress as our child is experiencing those behavioral activations. And then I'd like to say, finally, we can use both the PREMAC principle and behavioral activation together. So to both increase mood. And what we can do is we can use the first then approach and use something that our child has already identified that they want to do in a preferred task after their unpreferred task. And then I will go ahead and kick it off to Dr. Chadwell and Dr. Young if they'd like to add anything else.
I don't think I have anything additional. I just want to point out that I think those principles that you described are actually really beneficial to us as adults too. So I love to use the PREMAC principle myself in daily life. So I think as parents, we can think about, okay, how can I apply that to my own life too? So thank you, Joe. Dr. Young, do you have anything additional about motivation? Okay, so the next question is, how can you make the transition to a new school easier? And I can go ahead and start, and then others can join in too. I think this is a really great question. I think, first of all, the fact that we're recognizing this as a potential stressor is really, really wonderful, because you're absolutely right. It's stressful to change to a new school. And anytime we can anticipate a stressor, we want to, figure out ways that we can make that easier. So ways that we can make the transition to a new school easier, things that come to mind are thinking about, do we have opportunities to get some exposure to that new school before we transition? So one of the things I like to recommend is, just taking your child to drive by the school. and say, okay, here's our new building, and you can point out what you notice and your child can point out what they noticed. And then, driving by and also going into the school, you can do kind of a gradual exposure to it depending on the stress level that your child is experiencing. But going into the school, helping them navigate the hallways, if they have things like a locker, trying to do all of those, get exposure to those things before that transition occurs, can be really, really helpful in decreasing stress associated to that transition. The other thing that I think can be really helpful is coordinating with the new school. We've had schools in the past that, counselors from the previous school and the new school coordinate services together. So a counselor from the old school might say, oh, Susie had this, it was really helpful for Susie at this school. This was the coping card that she used. And this could be helpful in the new school. So just having that coordination of care can be really, really beneficial. And also then your child can meet that new school counselor before that transition occurs, or meet, some of the administrators, some of the teachers, depending on if your child will have multiple teachers or not. The other thing that you can ask for is some schools have like a student ambassador that meets your child upon a transition, or even can meet your child before the transition during a visit, and that child or that student, the student ambassador, can show them around the school, can help them transition from classes if they have to transition classes. What I really like about that is it gives them a peer to have a social relationship with initially, and I think that can really help to decrease some of the stress related to developing new social relationships in the new school. Joe and Dr. Young, do you have anything additional to add?
I was just going to share that, when we're making big transitions like this, we would expect, some stress that might come up. It's hard to make changes. And so something that can be helpful is, rather than waiting until like a big stress response happens, is really, I like to think of it as coping ahead, of having a plan in place that you can engage in, so that you're already engaging these coping strategies that work, so that then when we have kind of this change, if it's like an expected change, like a transition to a new school, then we are just adding on the new school stressor rather than trying to add on the school stressor and then also now trying to implement some new strategies. So coping ahead can be a really nice way for us to kind of ease that transition. It'll still be stressful though, probably.
I love that phrase, coping ahead.
Yes.
That's really great. And I think you bring up such a great point that we would expect to see a stress response in that situation. Absolutely. I'm going to click ahead to our next question here. So what's a stress reduction technique that a student can use when experiencing a surge of panic right before starting a game or a test? And I'll turn it over to Joe. Do you want to start with this one?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chadwell. And so there are a lot of ways to cope with stress, especially right before big events like a game or a test. I want to point out that the strategies I'm going to talk about are simple but effective. However, to make these strategies work, we really want to use them or practice them during non-stressful time periods. And so practicing calming strategies throughout the day, especially in a non-stressful time, will increase the likelihood that we will use that strategy in a more stressful event or situation. And so the first skill or tool I'd like to talk about is deep breathing. And it's a great skill to help us cope with stress. It can really be used anywhere. And when I talk about deep breathing, I'm talking about diaphragmatic breathing. And what that does is we're breathing from our diaphragm, or from the center of our belly. And what we're doing is we're slowing our physiological, emotional, and cognitive responses. It's purposeful breathing. And what that does is that reduces our responses in our parasympathetic nervous system, or the part of our brain that controls our response to stress. And that includes our response, or our hormone, stress hormone, cortisol. And so what we want to do is we want to practice deep diaphragmatic breathing, where we're breathing in through our nose for about 3 to 5 seconds. We're pausing for a moment, and then we're breathing out through our mouth for the same time that we've inhaled. And I want to emphasize the practice in these skills. And when we're doing these during a non-panic mode, we're able to and as well as incorporating it into a routine, like before bed, maybe before practice or after breakfast, we are helping kind of model that we're going to use this skill in a more stressful situation, makes the likelihood increase for that. The second skill that I like to talk about is self-talk. And that's that inner voice inside our head that provides that running monologue throughout our day. And self-talk can actually influence our mood, which we know impacts our behavior. And so what we want to do is we want to start to encourage positive self-talk. And that's another simple and effective skill that we can practice when we're stressed out. And positive self-talk helps us approach situations in a more productive and helpful manner. It helps us to identify thoughts that might be a little less helpful or negative, and it replaces them with a more adaptive thought. And one tip I would or would encourage for you to use with your children is help your child treat themselves like they would treat their best friend. That is, have them try not to say something bad or negative about themselves, because they wouldn't say that to one of their best friends. We also want to be really gentle and encouraging through this process and understand that it is a process and it does take time to identify some of those maybe unhelpful thoughts and to replace it with a more adaptive or helpful thought. Another way that we can help this is by limiting negativity or exposure to negativity, such as in our social media or video games. And then finally, we can practice an attitude of gratitude or practicing gratitude. And I like to do that through an attitude of gratitude, which is writing one or two things that we are grateful for throughout the day. And what that does is that starts to recondition our mind into thinking in a more positive or adaptive manner. And then I will go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Chadwell and Dr. Young if they'd like to add anything else.
No, I think you could bring up such great points. And, I think that as parents, we can model that too. So like that attitude of gratitude, I think sometimes that can be really hard for our youth that are having a lot of unhelpful self-talk. But I think one of the things that we can do is we can try to help them and we can model it. We know it's just a stressful time that we're living in, and what we can try our best to really channel that attitude of gratitude. And over time, with more exposure and practice, that our children will be able to exhibit, or more likely to exhibit those things too. The other thing that I think that came to mind with this question too, is just like we talked about in some of the previous questions is, how can we reach out to or coordinate with like something like the school or the coach or a coach to let them know that, our child might be experiencing some of these things. I think if we reach out to the school, it could be helpful for teachers to know, hey, my student is really having a difficult time before tests. Are there things that we maybe could do? Sometimes classroom wide, they can do some deep breathing before the test comes up. Or before starting a game, I think it could be helpful for a coach to know that your child might be exhibiting some of these things. And then you can really work together as a team to help them through it.
And it also makes me think of the last question with some of the, like a game or a test. It's usually predetermined, not like a pop quiz, but something that's already maybe in the schedule, something that we're preparing for or practicing for. So if this is something that kind of becomes a pattern, where we're noticing, okay, right before a start of a game or right before a test, you're pretty consistently having difficulties with kind of managing our physiological responses, right? We're having difficulty with managing our breathing. Maybe we're tearful. Maybe we get so anxious that we want to do anything to avoid playing in the game or taking the test. So if we notice that becomes a pattern, it's okay to just explicitly state that and have a conversation about it and coming up with a plan that a kid can maybe use to, again, maybe cope ahead, so that they can start to kind of get their mind and their body in a place where we're already engaging in some self-calming, some self-soothing strategies before we even get into the situation where we're starting to experience kind of like that elevated feelings where it might cause some panic symptoms. That's the only thing I wanted to add to that. Yeah.
I think that's such a great point. Like, if it's something academic related, thinking about on the drive to school, if you're taking your child to school, is there a way we can prompt them, hey, let's practice our self-calming strategies. I think that is such a great thing to do. So before entering that space, absolutely. The next question is, how can I help my child balance priorities? Dr. Young, do you want to go ahead and start?
Oh man, this is a interesting question. I think it's a really important one to ask, because kids have a lot of responsibilities and a lot of priorities, right? They have school, they have sports, they have clubs, they have family time, time with friends. They got a lot going on. And so it is really important that we have a balance of that. So what I would probably do is first think about what needs to get done, right? Even if we don't like doing homework, even if we don't like doing our chores, what needs to get done? Make a list of that. Okay, and so then once we have an idea of what things need to get done, then we can kind of prioritize from there, right? What needs to get done tonight, or what can maybe wait until later or until the next day. But also we're just talking a lot about ensuring that we have a pretty solid social support as well as engaging in things that we value. So then you can work with your child to understand, how do we incorporate these things that you find important into your priorities, whether that's filtering it into things that they already have to do, or identifying some time where they can engage in some of those valued activities, like maybe going outside and playing basketball with friends, or spending some time on video games. So really it's about understanding what needs to get done, what things would we like to incorporate just to support overall well-being, and maybe what things can maybe wait a little bit. That's probably what I would do, as well as Joe earlier talked about the pre-MAC principle, where we do something that we don't like to do first, like eating vegetables, and then doing the thing that we really like after, like eating a piece of cake or dessert. That can also help balance that priorities, just ensuring that we get done what we need to get done, and then also do the things that we like to do in our free time. Anything that you all would like to add, Joe or Dr. Chadwell?
Yeah, definitely. I think going back to what Dr. Chadwell and Dr. Young, some of the tips about stressors, like visual cues around the house, especially identifying different things that they might be having a hard time setting priorities to, like homework, or that band recital at the end of the semester. Having those visual cues paired with that pre-MAC principle really does strengthen that scheduling sequence for these kids.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love the idea of kind of going through it together, having those conversations on, because I think that list making, like you were talking about, that gives away a skill, that helps shape something that they're going to be able to do further on into life, that I think is really, really beneficial. And something that comes to mind is when they do come to you with like maybe something new that they want to do, you can ask questions like, okay, let's think about, something comes to mind with students who want to take, lots of AP classes or honors classes. And we work with students sometimes that they have honors class after honors class after honors class. And we just have conversations about, okay, how do we feel like that's going to fit with our current, obligations that we have, and just, opening up the conversation for them to respond to, and think through, hey, maybe it's too much, maybe I won't take this class now, I'll take this other one, and then I can add this other one later on, when I'm feeling like I'm managing my stress a little bit better. I think this is a great question. I think it's one that, and again, as adults, we can really help to model in our own lives. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, I know there was a question submitted in the Q&A pod related to access to slides from today, as well as the video recording, and we will be emailing those out to you. So you'll get access to the slides, the Thrive workbook. As a reminder, any links that we referred to in the presentation, those will be active in your PowerPoint slides, so you'll be able to click on them to access those resources.
I see a question has popped up in the Q&A pod. Any tips for parents who struggle to get their kids to school? Ooh, love this question. There's a lot of things that we can do to support kids in getting them to school. I want to pass it off to Joe or Dr. Chadwell first before I maybe provide any input.
I think you can definitely go ahead and start. I do want to mention that this is such a big topic.
Yeah.
It's definitely going to be a focus of our January session related to anxiety, because we are seeing, especially after COVID, so many students having difficulty getting to school, and engaging in what we call like school refusal. And a lot of that tends to be anxiety based too. So trying to figure out what might be, making them feel worried or anxious about coming to school. But I did want to just mention that will definitely be covered in greater detail. But Dr. Young, if you want to give it some brief tips, and we can add in also.
Yes. Okay. So in terms of tips for helping kids who struggle to get their child to school. So yes, we will be talking about that further because it is a big concern. And I think we've seen a really big uptick of this kind of concern after distance learning was really an option. It really provided kids with an out of maybe something that was really challenging for them, which is maybe getting to school because we had to do it. And so in terms of that, what we can do just super briefly is kind of addressing that with them, right? Just talking through like, hey, this is something that we've been noticing and we want to help you kind of get to school. So you might talk through some of their values. Do they value, maybe learning or being around their friends during the school day? Can we find something positive that they like about the school environment? Additionally, we might also work with them to identify some people at the school that they maybe can check in with and set something like that up. But really, it's understanding kind of the function of anxiety. So with anxiety, we know is that it's going to cause some of those stomach aches, headaches, things that make us not want to really go to school. And so we really have to just kind of navigate and kind of overcome some of those symptoms. And we'll absolutely be talking about that at our future webinar. So I guess a little teaser for you for that, but it's really identifying what strategies can we use to kind of reduce some of these symptoms to get us to school. And this could be like with the transition to the new school, maybe it's just getting increased exposure to going to school. Maybe it's just driving in the morning, on the weekends, it's driving to the parking lot to help them get that exposure.
And I think you bring up such a great point, it's for situations like that, it's so important that we work to coordinate with the school, so that we're identifying things that can be useful. And we know that this is challenging for our student, right? And anytime something is challenging, we want to think about how can we reinforce this? What kind of what kind of payout can we give our student for doing something that's really, really challenging for them? Like Dr. Young had mentioned, sometimes it's maybe initially as we walk into the school building, it's, meeting our preferred person at school. And then we're starting to pair that preferred person with that school environment, and that sets up a really great connection. Other times it's how can we provide access to something reinforcing at home for meeting whatever goal it is that we set. But I think it's really important to work with the school to identify a plan, start small, so that they can contact success, and then over time you can gradually increase maybe the amount of time that they are being at school. But I think the key thing is just how can we recognize what it is that's stressing them in the school environment, and how can we work to decrease those stressors and make it a more positive environment, and collaboratively with the school. If you have an outside therapist, with that therapist, just everyone working together, I think you'll have the best outcomes. Really great question. Anything, and Joe, sorry, anything additional that you would like to add for that one?
I really agree and appreciate, understanding the function of the child's behavior on why they're not wanting to go to school. And then one of the supports that Dr. Chadwell talked about is, meeting that preferred staff member at school. That would be called a check-in, check-out, where they're talking about some of the things that they want to do for the day, maybe any worries that might arise, coping strategies or problem-solving abilities if that event occurs. And then at the end of the day, they would check out and kind of detail how did that plan go. And so if that's something that you would be interested in talking with your staff, I would mention a check-in, check-out intervention.
Thank you, Joe. And then we did have another question in the Q&A pod related to autism specifically. And what I would say is, I can kind of start, and then Dr. Young and Joe, you can jump in too. But I would say just a few things come to mind. Anything that we had talked about in the presentation related to different coping strategies, like our behavioral skills training, thinking about how we can use behavioral skills training to teach different coping strategies or teach different cool down tools. That's going to be something that I think can be really beneficial. And it really depends. We know with autism spectrum disorders, there's such a range in just like receptive and expressive language development. So we kind of have to go back to think about, okay, just think through where is my child functioning, and what teaching style is going to be the most beneficial. And then from there, we can work to directly teach those skills and practice those skills. The other thing that comes to mind is oftentimes with autism spectrum disorders, we might have more sensitivity to sensory information. So I think that tip related to evaluating the stimulation and how stimulating the environment is, really working to reduce that extra stimulation. So is there a certain, maybe at school, sometimes our learners who have that extra sensitivity to sensory stimulation, we know that schools tend to have a lot of stimulation with classroom noises and noises in the cafeteria, so some of our learners appreciate being able to wear like headphones or cancel out, listen to music, cancel out some of that stimulation. And then the other thing that I think we would really think about is, are they, what additional services are they getting within the school environment? And, how can we coordinate our strategies to reduce stress with the school? So, do they have something like an IEP? Are they receiving extra services? And is there anything within that IEP related to coping with some of the stress that they're experiencing? And Dr. Young and Joe, do you have anything additional to add?
I was just going to, I completely agree with all of those things. And I mean, for children with autism spectrum disorder, or really a lot of, different kids, is that not every single strategy is going to stick, and not every single strategy is going to work, or we're going to have to kind of slightly modify it so that it works best for our unique child. And so it's okay if some of these strategies don't work the first time, or it's okay if we have to modify them. It's really all about understanding with your child, how can we use these strategies that work, but maybe tailor it so that it's maybe just more reinforcing for them to use. So even if it's like I'm thinking through, like the reaching out for support people, like having a really broad understanding of like who can and who cannot be support people. I think something that we always think about is just friends and, teachers, but is there people within groups that the kids are a part of, or are there other individuals within the community that maybe we can link youth to that might maybe understand a little bit more about what they might be going through? Just really kind of broadening kind of some of the things that we might be doing. But really, it's all about practice, all about making things reinforcing. But I think a lot of these strategies, I've implemented several of them with children who have autism, and sometimes the strategies stick, they really love it, and then other times they don't, and that's okay, because that's usually what we would expect for any child. So yeah, I think the strategies that you discussed, Dr. Chadwell, I think are really helpful.
The only other thing that I think comes to mind is like with that behavioral skills training, if we find that there's a component that students are struggling with related to like socializing, if maybe socializations, engagement in social interactions is something that's stressful for them, we can use that behavioral skills training to teach those skills as well. So not only are we going to use it to teach the coping strategies, but also to teach social skills, so that hopefully when they're entering those social engagement opportunities, we can, give them those skills which would then then in and of itself help to reduce some of the stress related to interacting and socializing with others. So we might teach them how to, greet another student, and we can work with the school counselor to help them practice in that environment, so that over time they're becoming more fluent with greeting another student. And then we would extend it beyond just the greeting to, offering, a piece of information or asking a question. These are things that can be directly taught. And if we use that behavioral skills training 4-step sequence, it really can help set our students up for success. Great questions. Thank you again for your time today. We will be providing access to all of the materials. Please feel free to contact us with any questions.